I usually use the handheld when I preach here because I don't know what to do with my arms. So now I've got this on, so we'll see what these do. I'm sharing a topic with you that I'm really passionate about. And I feel like this morning I just want to minister to you, to your hearts, for you, and just hope that this can be a healing time. I want to share about two different people. And as I describe them to you, I want to see if you recognize any of yourself in them. First, we're going to start with Anna. And since the pandemic, she just seems a little bit off. You know, she doesn't know what it is, but she just doesn't feel like herself. It's like she's in a fog. And she's watched some of her colleagues lose their jobs. She's witnessed loved ones battle through illness, even some of her friends lose their lives. She can't stop watching the news, and every time she turns on the news, she just sees what new horror is in the world. And she takes that when she climbs into bed, and her mind is just going over all the things that she's experienced, she's been watching. And she's beginning to feel helpless, depressed, and unmotivated. Most days, she's just exhausted, and it's hard work to get through the day. Before the pandemic, she really leaned into her faith, just to help her cope with some of the challenges in life. But now she's starting to question, is God really good? She feels like she's disconnected from him. She's confused about what she's believing, and she's starting to withdraw from community. Though she has a lot of friends that she can call on for help, more and more she's starting to isolate and withdraw and not share what's going on in her life with other people, and is just keeping it all close to her chest. She's getting angry with her family, her children in particular, the smallest little things. She has these overreactions and irritation and rage. And she just doesn't understand why she can't snap out of it. Then we have Brian, and he's been on staff at a church for about 6-7 years, and he's involved in all sorts of things. He's preaching and teaching and leading groups, and he's doing counseling, and he's on the worship team, and he goes on missions, and he's doing all the things. And more, as his life gets busy, he's just finding like he's struggling to keep up. He's more irritable at home, and someone he was really close to, a young man that he had been mentoring, got offended, left the church, and took his whole small group with him. And so now he's in a season of trying to recover from that loss, but then is also hearing things that he's the center of a lot of gossip. So he has become hurt, cynical, critical. He's procrastinating. He's irritable with others. He's struggling to concentrate. When he goes home, he's numbing himself with food, series, and alcohol. He's not sleeping well. He's constantly tired, battling with insomnia, and he's been dealing with a lot of headaches and stomach issues. Does this seem familiar to anyone? Can you relate to any of these symptoms? I feel like this is such a critical topic for people in ministry. And I want to share some interesting statistics with you. In a survey that was done, 75% of people in ministry stated that they are extremely or highly stressed. 40% experience monthly conflict with people in their congregations. 80% will not be in ministry in the next 10 years. 91% have experienced some form of burnout. 70% say that they have lower self-esteem than when they entered the ministry, are fighting depression. 70% say that they do not have a close friend, and 90% believe that they have not adequately been trained for what the actual realities of ministry are. Burnout, trauma, compassion fatigue, these are realities. These are realities for ministry. and not only for us in ministry, but for people in the world today. So I want to unpack a little bit about trauma, compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma as well. They're similar but different. Burnout is a state of physical and emotional and mental exhaustion, which is caused by prolonged exposure to stress, and it occurs when you just feel completely overwhelmed, emotionally drained, and unable to meet the ongoing demands of your life. And it's often the demands of the workplace, but it doesn't just end when we leave the office. There's life as well. Burnout is a big risk for people in helping professions. Are we gone? There we go. And for Christian leaders who have a calling to care for other people. And compassion fatigue refers to deep emotional exhaustion, which is experienced after repeated exposure to people's pain and to people's stories and situations. This exhaustion diminishes our capacity for empathy. And people who are naturally empathic, who have high levels of compassion and the ability to connect to other people emotionally, are particularly vulnerable to compassion fatigue. It can be described as having absolutely nothing left to give. Whereas vicarious trauma refers to a profound shift in your worldview after being repeatedly exposed to the stories or the situations of others. So though they may not have personally experienced the trauma, their body doesn't know that, and it's responding as if they were experiencing the trauma. So that might be by intrusive images, or nightmares, or struggling to concentrate, or highly startled all the time on hyper alert. So helpers can simultaneously experience compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma. And it's cumulative. It builds up over time, which is why taking care of ourselves, self-care, is just so important. There was a study that was done about the most dangerous jobs in the world, and these were jobs that were for high risk of developing PTSD. So naturally, they surveyed careers like military and the police and firefighters, first responders, even journalists who were on the front lines in like war-torn countries, or first to break stories of different horrors. But the Danielson Institute out of the University of Boston thought, where are the clergy? And so they did a study where they did a survey of cross-section of people, men and women in ministry, and it came back that 35% of people who are in ministry carry severe red flags for PTSD, and 30% of them would have enough symptoms or red flags to meet a clinical diagnosis for post-traumatic stress disorder. Taking that into consideration, it places it above military, above all those other careers that were listed as being the most dangerous career or most high risk for post-traumatic stress disorder. So it makes you ask the question, why? We just preach on Sundays? We don't do anything else, right? Well, there's 3 reasons, primary factors. Firstly, as people in ministry, we are exposed to a lot of trauma. And this is either by direct experience or through the stories of the people in our congregations. It is a high-stress job where there's high expectations, often low support, and often a lot of high criticism. Everybody's an armchair expert, hey? As far as how you could have done it better, or they could have done it better. And third, pastors often lack the training when it comes to working with people and working with their pain, working with their struggles, and working with the different dynamics relationally that is involved in ministry. And so due to that feeling of being ill-equipped, it becomes really overwhelming and highly, highly stressful. So a lot of the anxiety that we feel is actually alertness, hyper-alertness, or our body's response to distress, which then leads to an adrenaline surge, which is followed by a crash, and an exhaustion, which can lead into depression or burnout. Oftentimes, if you think about it, if a family is in crisis, who's the first person they call? the pastor. If a couple is in marital distress, if someone dies, if there is some kind of crisis, we call the pastor. All your apologetics and biblical interpretation and New Testament training doesn't always come in handy when you're trying to figure out how to help a scene of domestic violence that you've been called into as a pastor. Not so? And so you can imagine how, or relate to or understand why it can be quite overwhelming or quite stressful. We've been through things like church splits, or people that you love, that you've sown into, decide to leave. False accusations, division within leadership, sudden financial hardship, even having to deal with, and especially for us in the last 2 years, having to deal with a global pandemic. That wasn't part of your dream, was it? It might not seem that dramatic. It might be growing up in a home with an emotionally unpredictable parent, where you never knew what you were going to be getting that day. And so you were constantly on a differently. Some people can go through a horrific experience and are relatively unscathed. And this often has to do with their own prior trauma history, their current stressors in their life, the quality of their relationships that they have, as well as their own inner level of resilience. Where for other people, they could go through the same thing, and it's as if their life has lost meaning. They may struggle to experience pleasure, things that they used to enjoy, be overwhelmed with stress and anxiety, and have difficulty sleeping. Sometimes that might last for a week or 2 weeks, but for some people, they get stuck. And that overwhelm or that trauma response continues to play out in their life to the point that it starts interfering with their ability to function and their ability to connect with other people. And this is when it starts crossing over to a post-traumatic stress disorder. So if we look at the story of Elijah, and he put himself on the line after being in hiding for 3 years of drought. If we look in 1 Kings chapter 18, and there's that incredible, mountaintop experience in Mount Carmel, and then he reached the end, and all of these continuous stresses he faced built up till we get to chapter 19, when he cries out, "I have had enough. I would rather die than go on facing this day in and day out." When I just can't do this anymore, that point of desperation. So if we look spiritually at what Elijah has gone through, it's very similar to people that have been in prolonged trauma. And part of the consequences of it is that loss of purpose in life, having your self-image destroyed, feeling like you're alone in the world, like no one understands, being filled with resentment and bitterness, feeling like all is hopeless, having a lack of enthusiasm towards your spiritual life, maybe even carrying anger towards God. But because of that anger, a good Christian isn't angry at God, so then there's levels of shame and guilt that come in, feeling like this isn't fair. I don't deserve this suffering, that maybe God has somehow failed me. And we start to doubt. We start to doubt ourselves, we start to doubt God, and we've entered into a desert experience. And that gloom and that spiritual barrenness weighs so heavily, especially when you've been put in a position where you're always supposed to be on the mountaintop, where people are looking to you to tell them what's coming next. Meanwhile, it feels like I don't know how to get myself out of this hole. So when we feel out of control, we have a desperate desire as human beings to regain a sense of control. And we usually do this either by overfunctioning, white knuckling. This is my classic MO. I'm feeling overwhelmed and stressed. What should we do? Let's just do more. Let's just do more. Let's work harder. Let's strive. For other people, it might be underfunctioning. You know what? I just can't. I'm just going to throw my hands up in the air. I'm helpless. Somebody else do it for me. Because I'm actually trying to control the response around me because I can't control what's happening. Does that make sense? Or having inappropriate responses to situations. So coming home and holding it together all day long and then emotionally vomiting all over the people that you love the most for really no reason at all. Here's what I want us to look at today. God wired our bodies. When He created us so intricately, so incredibly, that we were made to survive. He created us with a system within our body to respond to threats and to respond to situations in order to stay alive. So the thing is, we haven't always been taught how to handle and what to do with these responses in our body and to understand what is being communicated. The author Barbara Brown Taylor said that our bodies are prophets. They know when things are out of whack, and they say so. So God has designed us for our bodies and our emotions and our mind to work together and to help us move through hardships. And so we have an autonomic nervous system. And this is a miracle, guys. This is a miracle. And it's the part of the nervous system that controls our unconscious functioning. You know, our things like breathing and our heart rate and wakefulness and our instinctive response to threat. And there's two parts to this nervous system. There is the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. And I'm going to get a little deep here, but just please bear with me. So the sympathetic nervous system is what drives our fight or flight. So you're in a stressful meeting with your elders and something is raised and you feel threatened. And maybe you go into fight mode, which is I'm going to take you on. And I'm going to be aggressive and I'm going to be defensive. You know, in sort of classic fight or flight discussions, they would talk about the lion walking down the road and that's where you're going to take it on and rip it. In a meeting, it might come out a little bit differently. But it is, I'm going to fight to stay alive. This is the part that stimulates the cortisol and the adrenaline, our stress hormones, which allow us to be activated. And it might be the flight response. I just want to get out of here. You know, where's the door? I got to go. I got to move. I got to get away. It's where, you know, if that lion is coming at you, you're going to run as faster than you ever thought you could run. But then there's also a fawn response. And this is really common within ministry as well. I'm going to over-accommodate, and I'm going to do whatever I need to do to please the threat so that it won't hurt me. People-pleasing? Lack of boundaries? Because I don't want to get hurt. So we had a friend who was hijacked, and his response was classic fawn response. It was, I'm not going to look at you. Take the car, take the keys, just do whatever you want to do, just don't hurt me. He did what he needed to do to stay alive. His survival instinct kicked in. And that's wonderful in a situation like that. But in an elders meeting, when we're in a triggered space and we're just responding from our over-accommodating fawn response, it's not always so great. A lot of children that grew up in abusive homes will over-accommodate because that's how they learn to get by in their childhood. But now in adulthood, it's coming from a place of dysfunction. Then we have our and so in fight or flight or fawn, we are responding to the level of arousal that we're experiencing. So that's why sometimes you might feel slightly aroused or slightly triggered, and sometimes you feel full-blown panicky. You know, there's like a spectrum, which is linked to that level. Then we also, in our parasympathetic nervous system, that gets activated when we go into freeze state. And that's a way of coping when a person believes that they're in danger, but they have no escape. So if you think of animal shows, it's where they just fall down and play dead. Or in real, in our experience, we had a foster son, and the freeze response was his sort of go-to response. The thing is, because of the trauma that he had gone through, the slightest question where there was an expectation that he give a response would be triggering for him. So I could ask him a question as simple or, benign as, would you like a sandwich? And his eyes would go big, and he would just stand, and his mouth would be slightly open, and not a sound would come out. He was incapable of speaking, and he was frozen because his body sensed a threat. He went into a dysregulated state. His nervous system, parasympathetic nervous system kicked in, and he went into freeze mode. Have you ever had an experience where you're like, I can't find the words. You look back and you're like, I don't know why I did that. I don't know why I responded that way. You can think of all the things you wanted to say afterwards, but in that moment, you were frozen. Okay, so this can be frustrating, but it's survival. It's a way of protecting us without engaging our thinking brains. If we have a history of trauma, shame, or overwhelm, it might feel like these sensations are just happening to us, and it's like we have no control over our own lives. But once again, we have been designed by the master designer, and he has given us tools and ways to understand that if we know and we learn that, oh, okay, this is what's happening in my body, it's not as terrifying, and we can start finding our way back to feeling like we are in control. So once we are empowered to validate that underlying need that is being triggered, we can work on changing the situation. So if we look at how he designed our brains, I like to explain it to people as our brains having three floors, like a three-floor building. And the ground floor is like our primal brain, our reptilian brain. Okay, it's where our brainstem is located. It speaks the language of sensations, like that feeling in the pit of your stomach, or the temperature changes in your body. And this is what controls your bodily functions, your like sleep, breathing, heart rate, and it's also what responds when we've been activated. Then we have the fight, flight, or fawn, or freeze. Then we have the second floor, which is where our limbic system is. This is like the feeling brain, okay? It speaks the language of emotions, and it's where our hormone center is. So that's when this second floor sees a threat. Warning, warning, and it sets off the hormones, it speaks to the first floor, and your body is activated and ready to go into survival mode. The top floor, like in most buildings, is the penthouse. Okay, it's where the best, like the most important or the fanciest thing is, and that's your prefrontal cortex. That's your thinking brain, which speaks the language of words. But when we are in trauma, when we are in stress, when we have been triggered or activated, this part of our brain, the top floor, actually goes offline, and blood flow gets sent to the rest of your brain and body in order to keep you alive, so that you're ready to go, you're ready to flee, you're ready to fight. So when we are triggered, and you think, I don't know why I did that, exactly, you don't know why you did that, because your thinking brain has gone offline. And this is the part of our brain where we can problem solve, where we can think about our thinking, where we experience or are able to understand empathy and nuance, and it's all of our critical our thinking, executive functioning, and reasoning happens. So if that's offline, because think about it, if you're crossing the street and a car is barreling towards you, you don't have time to stop and make a pros and cons list to decide what is going to be the best option, like sorting all of that out. You're just going to respond. But now think about it if you're going through your life in a triggered state and your thinking brain is offline, and you're unable to tap into your empathy when you're connecting with other people because you're so triggered, and you don't understand your own thinking, it can be really challenging when you're working with other people. It can also be kind of dangerous if your thinking brain is offline and you're not consciously aware in how you're responding to others because you're in a heightened state of arousal. Make sense? Okay. So, we don't have to live in an offline state. God gave us cues that we can recognize when we are starting to become aroused. So as we pay attention, and as we are able to stay grounded in the here and now, our thinking brain stays online. So research shows that trauma and emotional dysregulation actually changes the way that our brain and our bodies function. So as we learn the signals, they become like a check engine light so that you can be warned that something is out of whack and that you need to explore it. So our bodies communicate to us through, remember I spoke this part of the brain speaks the language of sensations? So that's things like changes in temperature, tingling, or heat, or feeling like your fingers are pins and needles, having this intense urge to want to move, having an increased heart rate, unexplained anxiety, or your breathing changes, or you're suddenly alert, or you start feeling like you're trapped and stuck. If you start recognizing those sensations, that's your check engine light. Hang on, what's going on? What am I feeling? What am I experiencing? Do I feel unsafe? So emotional dysregulation also impacts on our connection with others. So if we deny our emotions, we shut off the wisdom of the body and we block ourselves from being able to effectively connect to those around us. Neurobiologically, we are blocked from being able to empathize. So if we can't recognize the feelings of others, we can't recognize our own feelings. So if you look on social media, for example, you see this all the time. People don't know what to do with their own pain, so they discharge it on others. And so comments and the way in which people can just attack one another so easily when they're triggered by the stuff that they're seeing. So learning to check your engine lights, learning to recognize, is my heart rate changing? What could be going on? Getting curious about it. And knowing that we have to boundary those things. We have to boundary those things. And learning to recognize when we're feeling out of control and taking a moment, rather than just ignoring our body's signals and white-knuckling or soldiering on. So if we ignore, numb, or disconnect our emotions, the wisdom of our bodies will find another way to communicate it. And even if it means through panic attacks, or chronic illness, or depression, or spiritual dryness. And this is something that I had to learn the hard way. And a few years ago, I was, in a build-up of just stress. And even though I'm a social worker, and I'm trained to help people through their trauma, I don't know how to social work myself, And so I was working through some intense stuff. And I was experiencing all the stories of the people that I was working with. And I wasn't doing a very good job of self-care. So I was carrying that pain that wasn't mine. And so I started experiencing that pain as if it was my own. My body didn't know the difference. And I was pushing myself too hard, and everything just came crashing down. I ignored the check engine light until my body stopped. And it was actually through going through burnout, developing a chronic illness, and having to completely change my life that I learned it's time to listen. It's time to listen. We can't keep pushing and thinking that we're going to be okay. So I had to learn that it's okay to have limits. I was created to have limits. Right at the very beginning, when God created the world, the last thing he did on the seventh day What was it for? Rest. Because we have limits and we need to rest. And it's in those places of rest that we can connect back to ourselves. We can let our bodies recover. We can let our souls recover. Rest is holy. Rest is holy. And somehow we've got this message that the glory is in hustle. But the glory is in rest. So, learn to set boundaries. You are responsible for your time. If you give all your time away, that's on you. You are responsible for your time. You are responsible for your thinking. Boundary your thoughts. When you start ruminating over what happened in that meeting, or that person that wasn't there, or this person that left the church, or this situation, stop it. Boundary it. Because it will start building up inside. And then our body starts responding in stress. I had to learn not to feel shame for having weaknesses and for having limitations. When I stopped pushing, I felt more connected to myself, more connected to God, and more connected to those around me. I discovered that God wasn't disappointed in me because I got sick. It didn't diminish my calling. It didn't diminish my purpose. And once I was able to stop operating from my strength, I was actually able to invite God in and allow him to be my strength. And so I have experienced so much healing by walking through the valley of illness and the grief and the trauma of having to pick up the pieces when your life just falls out from underneath you. I discovered that Jesus is a compassionate witness to our pain. And just like I've experienced pain, so has he. If you think about in the garden, on the cross, he's experienced physical suffering, emotional suffering, and he experienced the fullness of our humanity. So he understands. He understands this weight. He understands the reality of trauma, and he shows us how to enter into it and through it, not deny it or avoid it. Andy Kolber said, his sacred invitation to honor our pain is holy work and a journey to which we are all called. He is so comfortable with the expression of our pain, and he holds space for our emotions. In John chapter 11, this is the story of when Lazarus has died, and he waits, and he goes to meet with Mary and Martha, and their friends after Lazarus had died. He sees the grief of Mary and the other Jews, and his response is described in the shortest verse in the Bible, which is, Jesus wept. Jesus wept. So now just think about this for a minute. Just think about this. He knew what was coming. He knew what was coming. And yet, he entered into the present grief of his friends. He held space for them. They had just lost their dear brother and friend, so of course they were going to be devastated. Of course they were going to be filled with sorrow and pain. And Jesus didn't shame them, but he validated their humanity, and he shared in it by weeping with them. He lamented with his friends. When he wept with them, he was giving them permission and teaching them how to process their emotions. He joined them in their grief. So by allowing them to feel their feelings, he was allowing them to tap into their body's natural way of experiencing and processing emotion so that they could integrate it into their bodies without it becoming trauma. How beautiful. How healing. As the creator of our neurobiological structures, he knew that their limbic systems needed to move through that emotion and not have it shut down. He didn't rush them. He provided empathy, compassion, and patience. This is a model for us. As we seek to pay compassionate attention to our own experiences, we can give compassionate attention to others' experiences and help them move through their pain so that they don't feel shamed and shut it down. When I work with people, it's incredible how many times when they start crying, people's first response is to apologize. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Please cry. Please cry. God designed our bodies to experience tears so we can move through the emotion so it doesn't get caught as trauma in our bodies. So he sees that the emotional and physical bruises that we've suffered, and Jesus is tender to our humanity. He teaches us the value of being compassionate. So now I want to give you a few practical tools in how do we navigate it. It's one thing to go, yes, we must feel, but how do we do that? How do we move through it? So firstly, it's with self-compassion. Christian Neff describes 3 components to self-compassion. The first is mindfulness, second is self-kindness, and the third is common humanity. Mindfulness sounds woo-woo, but it really just is paying attention. Taking a deep breath. What am I feeling? What's happening inside? Self-compassion is, as Brené Brown would say, talking to yourself the way you would someone you love. Would you ever speak to someone else the way you speak to yourself? The way we routinely beat ourselves up for whatever, but rather speak kindly to ourselves. And the third is common humanity. We're not alone. We're not alone. We were created for community, and we heal in community. So knowing we're not alone in our pain can give us the courage to reach out and to find some support. Ask for help. So that might be leaning on your friends, leaning on your spouse, or finding different ways to connect to find support. But sometimes we need more than just what our friends can give us. And that's where it is vital to reach out and go to somebody who is skilled to help you on a therapeutic journey. I don't understand why there is such a resistance to therapy in Christian circles. Because, as I said, we heal in community. And so there is something that is so helpful in being with someone who has the tools to help you process your journey. So if you think of a midwife knows how to help a woman to be able to give birth to a healthy baby. But it is the mother who births the baby, not the midwife. Not the midwife. She will journey with her, but she can't, but she can't birth the baby. So a counselor can't work harder on your healing than you can, but they can be a compassionate companion on your journey. Move your body. Move that stress out of your body. Whether it's dancing in your kitchen or swimming or running or Pilates or whatever it is, move your body. Make time for rest. As I said, it's holy. Set boundaries, lament, meditate on scripture. Do you know that if you breathe in for 4 seconds and out for 6 seconds, it overrides the stress response in your brain, helps your thinking brain to stay online, and shuts down the fight or flight or fawn response or freeze. So if you meditate on scripture and breathe in, the Lord is my shepherd, exhale, I shall not want. His grace is sufficient for me. There is no fear in love. Breathe in, breathe out. The peace of Christ. Guard my heart and mind. Be still and know that I am God. Meditate on his word. as we collectively learn to embrace our vulnerabilities, embrace our humanity, and be aware of how we are triggered, it diminishes the shame. It diminishes the shame. We are not less than because we experience our emotions. As we hold space for our grief and become compassionate witnesses to others, we can truly be God's vessels in ushering in healing to our people, but starting with ourselves. Because we're not okay. And that's okay. That's okay. I want to speak a scripture over us in closing. And I want to invite you to just close your eyes. This is my favorite scripture. And I'm going to ask you to take a deep breath in, a deep breath out. Notice what you're feeling. Just notice what you're feeling. Are you tired? Worn out? Burned out on religion? Come to me. Get away with me, and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me, and you'll learn to live freely and lightly.